spent 31 years educating students at USA, will be retiring next year. He has a BA degree from Trinity College in San Antonio and a master's and PhD from the University of Alabama. And among his research interests are public opinion, religion and politics, and Quebec. So
Quebec?
Ask him about that. Without any further ado, Dr. Sam Fischer.
Oh, they got that right. Sometimes they don't residential, and that's not good. Absolutely.
First, thank you very much for inviting me. Can you hear me?
No, not very well.
There's,
Okay.
uh-oh.
Does that work?
Yeah, just get close to it.
Okay, all right, I'll try to get close to it. Okay, today I was going to talk about redistricting, and it's gotten a lot of news and attention lately because it has an impact on who shows up in Congress and also state legislature. So this is going to be sort of a quick tutorial on redistricting. One of the terms when we think about redistricting, okay, we think about gerrymandering, and gerrymandering is a term that we use where districts are drawn to favor a particular group or particular political party or partisan faction or whatever. And so gerrymandering and the issue of redistricting goes all the way back early to our history. Okay, so this is a cartoon from, I think, 1812. This is the original gerrymander.
And he has agreed to share these slides. So we're dealing with the environment we have. They'll be on the website and the Facebook page.
Okay.
Thank you. Sorry.
Right. So Governor Jerry of Massachusetts wanted to have the districts, the state legislative districts, drawn in favor of his party. And he got accused of skewing the districts, and the cartoonist drew it as sort of a salamander. And so they conflated gerry and salamander into gerrymander. So gerrymandering is a term that we've been using all these years to talk about skewing the districts in a particular way to favor some particular party. So again, this is nothing new. One of the issues, and I'm not going to get into this, but to think about is what does it mean to represent? So whether I am a city council person, state legislator, congressman, senator, how do I represent? And different people do it in different ways. In the classes, we talk about it in terms of you can choose to be a delegate. That is, you send me to Washington and I will just take whatever your views are and relate them and vote that way, but I'm not concerned about what I feel. Or I could act as a trustee. That is, you elected me because I'm intelligent, I know what's best, and I'll just do whatever I want in your interest. Okay? But I won't even bother to come back and ask what you think about it until it's time for elections. Typically most will do some combination of the two. Okay? But again, representation is a very difficult issue. And who's getting represented? Is it everybody? Is it just the supporters? And also representation doesn't necessarily conform to geographical lines. So when we think about elections today, and you look at campaign contributions, say for the 1st Congressional District of Alabama, those campaign contributions aren't limited to just businesses or individuals in this district. They're coming in from all across the country. Okay? Because what Bradley Burns does and other congressmen in Washington has an impact beyond just their districts. Okay, so one of the big things about politics is the rules of the game, and this has an impact on districting. So we have single-member districts. There was a period where we had multi-member districts, but that's sort of gone out of fashion. The other is we try to create districts that are equal in population. And the notion is everybody's vote should carry the same weight. So in the case of Baker versus Carr out of Tennessee, it was an issue of rural districts, in essence, electing representatives, I'm just picking this number out of the air, for 10,000, one representative for 10,000 people. In an urban area, say Nashville, electing one representative for 100,000 people. So the rural district was carrying more weight. The other thing is the Constitution requires a census every 10 years. And based on that census, we have to reapportion congressional seats in the House of Representatives. Another point is, early on, the Constitution said we'd have one representative for every 35,000 people. Over time, that got to be a little unwieldy, so Congress put a cap on it in 1925 at 435. So that means as the population grows and shifts, some states will gain representatives, other states will lose, and also typically the number of people per district also increase. The Constitution leaves it up to the state to draw the lines. So each state legislature determines how the lines are drawn. And here it becomes real interesting because obviously if you're the dominant party in the state legislature, you're going to have the biggest say in how these lines are drawn. Right now, after the 2010 census, an ideal number would be approximately 710,000 per district. In Alabama, it works out to about 686,000. So each of our 7 representatives represent a whole lot of people, okay? And they've got lots of different perspectives and ideas. Okay, so why do we district? Obviously, there are the legal reasons, the constitutional reasons, but we also do it on the basis of partisanship, which is typically what we see. That is, if I'm the dominant party in the state legislature, I want to draw the districts to favor my party. There's also the emphasis on favoring incumbents, okay, and protecting their districts. Also, there are racial, ethnic reasons for drawing district lines, and then there are combinations. Okay, so as an example of redistricting and its impact, and also sort of our history. I'm sorry about the slide, the title's drawn. But there was a case out of Tuskegee years and years ago, and the issue was, could you draw lines based on race? Okay, and so in, I think it was the 1950s, the original district or city boundaries for Tuskegee was literally a square, what you see there. Okay, so as blacks got the right to vote, blacks were coming into gaining access to the ballot, the city of Tuskegee decided, well, we don't want blacks to have any real choice in terms of city government, so what we're going to do is redraw the lines. So they redraw the lines in such a way as to ensure that whites were the overwhelming majority. Okay. In this case, went to court. The Supreme Court said, no, you can't do that. One of the issues about redistricting is you can have overrepresentation of one group or the other, and people sometimes argue that it's wasting votes. So if I'm in a district that's predominantly Democratic, then I'm not, and I'm a Democrat, then my vote is sort of being overused. Okay? And there's an argument you need to have more competitive districts so each side's vote counts for more. There's also the question of a skewed political agenda. So if a district is overwhelmingly one particular outlook, then the minority in that district, whatever that may be, whether it's ethnic, economic, or whatever, gets underrepresented. And there is also the argument that you have greater polarization. That is, if I'm a representative from a district that's fairly homogeneous, then I don't really have to pay attention to what others may feel that may be different. So here's the current district in Alabama, the way it's drawn. And so we have 7 representatives, 6 Republican and 1 Democrat. Okay. Years and years ago, it was flipped. That is, you had more Democrats than Republicans, because if you remember your history, if you wanted to win an office in Alabama, you had to be a Democrat. Okay? And that's slowly changed over the years. One of the things that changed this was after the 1990 census, there was a movement to have a majority-minority district. That is, a district that would have a greater possibility of electing a minority, black. And so there was a case in the federal courts here in Mobile to try to draw the lines that would create that situation. Interesting in terms of the people there in court were also Republicans were arguing for it at the time in the state. Okay, so you're going, well, why would the Republicans advocate for a majority-minority district? Well, for them, the long-term game was if you pack Democratic voters in, then it's going to make Republican chances greater in other districts, which is exactly what happened, plus a shift in party identification. So now we have sort of a flip from what we've had before. So how we draw the lines does have an impact on who's going to get represented and which parties are going to be successful. Okay, I should have had the slide earlier. When we redistrict, there are different choices you can make. You can try to make it representative of the population, or you can try to skew it to one group or the other. So this is a good diagram on gerrymandering. So in the first instance, think of that's a state where 60% are blue and 40% are red. So if there's perfect representation, you would have 3 districts that were going to be blue and 2 that are red. Okay, that would be perfect. If you wanted to have compact districts, instead of having them all strung out like that, you can do that, but you end up with 5, all of the districts blue, and there's no representation for the red. Okay. Another way is you can have it neither compact nor fair. That is, you get the real strange looking lines, and you end up with 2 blue districts and 3 red districts. Okay, so again, going back to the first, 60% are blue, 40% are red. So in this particular instance, neither compact nor fair is drawn in a way to favor, in this case, the minority, the red, over the blue. Okay, so how these lines are drawn can have an impact in terms of representation. Okay, so you can either have it represent proportionally what people are in the state, or you can draw it to one party's favor or over another party. And that's sort of the bone of contention right now. Okay. This is a site, it's 538, and what they've done is they've taken all this information about districts, and so we're going to look at Alabama. And they do different scenarios on how to redraw lines. So this is what it looks like now. Okay.
That's the congressional district?
These are congressional districts, yeah. Okay. Yeah, if we went to state legislative districts, it would be very, very difficult to see. Okay.
And what was that website that was?
It's called 538.com.
Thank you.
Okay.
You're good. You're good.
Let's see. Okay. Okay. So here we're going to gerrymander it to favor Republicans. Okay. And it's the same essentially. You don't get any change from what we currently have to what we have if we intentionally change it to Republicans. And one thing I want to note is back when they had the court case, when they're going through the redistricting, you could actually go to Montgomery and they had an office with this big giant map, video map, and you could sit at a computer and you can draw the lines. And I took my class, my legislative process class, and their job was to draw it so to create a majority-minority district, and also one that would increase the odds of Republicans getting elected. The map they drew was very, very similar to what was ultimately ruled acceptable. Okay, so it doesn't take a whole lot of thinking to do it. All right. So that's what it looked like for Republicans. Okay, if we did it to favor Democrats, okay, we get 2 Democratic districts, and the remaining 5 are Republican. Okay, so one of this is a reflection of the fact that there's not a lot of Democrats in the state, but it can be drawn in a way that would give them a better shot. So when you go to the site and you hover over that, it shows you the chances of a Republican being elected and or not being elected, Democrats. Okay, so right there, the chance of that district being represented by a Republican is 99.6%. I mean, it's a virtual certainty. Okay, here's one where you try to maximize competition. That is, you can draw the districts where they're more competitive. So it's not a sure shot that one side or the other is necessarily going to win. But the point I'm trying to get across is there are ways to draw district lines to increase competitiveness, to favor one party over the other, and it becomes a function of knowing where the voters are and what their proclivities are in terms of voting. Yes,
but they still have to balance the numbers against that, do they not, when we have so many people represented by a certain congressperson?
Right. You have to, when they draw the lines, you have to end up with each district being essentially the same size in terms of population. Okay. So here we got, to do that, you can see we get very strange looking lines. Okay. Yes.
Before the last time that they drew the legislative line for district-wide and all, there was another district that took in northern Baldwin County and the counties just north, and there was a Democrat there. And then when it was changed, Bradley Byrne and took in that area, and there was a Democrat that had been in that position, congressional district, and he just decided he wasn't even going to try to run.
Right. One of the things that can happen is if, as I said before, typically incumbents get protected, but if that incumbent is out of favor or is an incumbent of another party and they want to increase the odds of, in this case, Republicans doing better, then their lines are going to be redrawn. In essence, then they've got the problem of, how do I go out and convince voters who were not my constituents before to vote for me? And so that's not unusual that you'll see incumbents drop out if their district gets radically redrawn and they decide, well, I'm not going to get elected. There's somebody back. Oh, okay. All right. Yeah, she was talking about a district that was formerly Democrat that was redrawn and the Democratic congressman bailing out.
I've led a bad example. Can I ask you to hold your questions till the end, and we'll have Dr. Fischer complete his presentation?
All right. Okay. So anyway, you can go to this site and you can do this. They have it for every state. Like I said, I went to undergraduate school in Texas, and Texas has some really bizarre boundaries that extend hundreds and hundreds of miles. And so it's an interesting process to look and say, okay, what was the rationale for that one long string of land that's being represented, where the people in the southern part have totally different interests than the people in the northern part. Okay, so one of the things that have been suggested is, typically districts are drawn, for particular reasons. And so we get the courts involved in deciding whether something's acceptable or not. One argument has been that what we should do is go to multi-member districts. So instead of trying to draw geographical districts, everybody gets elected in the same election statewide. Okay, so like I said before, there has been an instance in the past where in Alabama we had statewide elections for our representatives. So one of the things is, how do you do it? Well, it was considered discriminatory in a lot of instances to have multi-member districts because minorities, again, however you define that, were very unlikely to be successful. And so the argument is we should go to single-member districts. And you saw that a lot in city councils and county commissions. One alternative is something called cumulative voting. Is anybody familiar with that?
Is that instant runoff voting kind of?
No, it's not instant runoff. That's something different. Okay. So cumulative voting is a process where if there are 5 positions, there are 5 seats, each of you would get 5 votes. Okay. And when you go to the voting booth, you apportion those 5 votes, either 1 for 5 different candidates, or all 5 votes for a single candidate, 3 for one, 2 for another. You divide it up however you want. Okay. And the notion is that if there's a minority interest and it's genuine, then they would cast all their votes for at least one candidate. Okay, so they might cast all 5 votes for that particular candidate, and they would get 1 representative, but that's all. Okay, but they would have a legitimate shot at getting some representation. Okay, if there's a large enough group and they're willing to commit all their votes to it. Okay, and then the notion is interest becomes self-defining. So if there's a genuine interest and it's minority and they want representation, then they have a good shot at it. Okay. The interesting thing is, anybody familiar with Chilton County? Okay, Chilton County uses this.
I see.
Okay, years and years ago, Chilton County they were having court cases, and this is back saying, well, we need to have a majority-minority district in the county. The problem was because of the patterns of where people were living, it was impossible to do. And so they went to this. Okay. Now the interesting thing, this is back when Democrats always won. And so when they went to cumulative voting, a black council person was elected for the county commission for the first time ever, but also a Republican was elected for the first time ever. Okay, and they still use cumulative voting, but that's one possibility of trying to resolve the issue of the controversies over redistricting. So I'm going to stop there. I think I've sort of zipped through it, but I think I got the gist of it. Okay. It's not always pretty.
No.
Yes, Barbara.
And from the little I have read, it seems that there's more, that in a smaller area, like a county, as opposed to a state,
Mhm.
you have more success with this notion of ranked choice voting, or whatever you call it.
Right.
Has anybody ever done it statewide?
No, I mean, nobody's done it statewide. But again, in the past, we have had instances where, in Alabama, there was a couple of periods of time where we elected our representatives statewide. So, again, if you go and you look at the maps and you look at how strangely they're drawn, you could make an argument that that's a really bizarrely drawn district. You might as well go to a statewide election. Okay. But again, it would be premised on, something like some sort of different voting system where minority interests have a shot at getting some representation.
Have you ever been involved in any of this redistricting of a panel? And also, we redistrict here And the legislature does the redistricting, is that it? I
Right,
can't
okay.
remember.
I've never been involved in
Doing it.
doing it.
Yeah,
Okay. But it varies from state to state, but typically the state legislature sets up a committee and they redraw the lines. And in some instances, the public can provide input into how this is redrawn.
Yeah.
There's also some states that set up a commission, and the commission draws the line in a nonpartisan fashion and then gets approved by the state legislature. So it will vary from states to states. Some states, I think it's Washington and Arizona, say, well, we should try to draw them as competitive districts. So, whatever the underlying logic behind redistricting is, that is, are we going to redistrict to favor whoever controls the state legislature? It's going to be drawn one way. If our thought is we should have competitive districts where it's up in the air about which party is going to win, you're going to get totally different lines. So,
Is it fair?
well, it depends upon your point of view. I mean, if I'm in control of the state legislature, I'd say, well, it's perfectly fair. The majority rules. Okay. Yes.
Would you say to those who, in a time when more and more people are against identity politics, why would there not be an effort to have all states, the total states, I don't know how to put it exactly, voting, when no districts are really drawn? And secondly, would you tell me what has just happened with California in their redistricting? Would you describe that?
Okay, I haven't looked. I know they're redistricting, but I'm not real familiar exactly with what they've done. I know there's been some people that said, well, we need to split the state up, and that's a reflection of, well, if we split the state up, then Republicans will get more power in the state because it's dominated by Democrats. And the thought is, if you
I thought it just finished it, but maybe I'm wrong about that.
okay.
It had to be done and drawn it dramatically so that in fact the Democrats would have more.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's, as I said before, there is attempts to put on the ballot a thing to split up the state because, just to create, I think, 3 states out of California. And it's a reflection of Republicans saying, well, we don't have a shot at it because of the way it's been redistricted. Okay. So, yeah, Democrats dominate. And just like here in Alabama, if...
We know how they feel.
Okay, all right. So if you're saying based on, should it be proportional to how people identify as Democrat or Republican?
Why would it be non-identity? In other words, if you're against identity politics, and we're all Americans,
Mhm.
why would we not move towards all states being required to not vote by district?
To do at large?
At large.
Yeah. I mean, that would be reasonable if, again, if in terms of voting, you can have the minority get some representation. And that minority is not necessarily racial. Okay. So in California, it's the minority are Republicans. So if we went to an at-large system, typically in an at-large system, majorities are always going to win. They're always going to overwhelm the minority, and that's why you've seen a change from at-large to single-member districts. Okay, but you have to change the way the voting works. So cumulative is one possibility. That is, if there's a minority that's cohesive and real, then they're going to pull their votes together to make sure they get at least one representative. Okay. But they're still going to be the minority. Yes?
Could you tell us something about the Gilby Whiteford case? Or, that Supreme Court case, the political gerrymandering? Are you familiar with that one?
No, I'm not.
Okay. All right.
Yes.
With the Alabama State Supreme Court, when cases are brought against redistricting and so forth, has the state Supreme Court come down in one particular direction with their precedents, or are they kind of all over?
I mean, there's one of the things the courts have not been very clear, especially in Supreme Court. Ultimately, these things go to the Supreme Court, and they get the final say. But the Supreme Court has talked about, especially cases out of North Carolina, we want compact or contiguous districts, but they've never given any clear definition. So if you're a state legislature and you're trying to say, okay, what's going to meet a standard, there's no real set, clear standard for states to decide, okay, is this good or bad? That is, if we went to the Supreme Court, are they going to approve it? So the Supreme Court has never been very, very clear. They've talked about, well, we shouldn't have racial gerrymandering and we shouldn't have some strangely shaped districts, but the reality is they haven't really come down and said, okay, here are the bright line rules on how to redistrict, what's fair, what works and what doesn't work.
So it's really just population equality right now?
Yeah, the major thing is it's always going to be population equality.
But shouldn't the states, if something goes to the Supreme Court, it's very political, and that's a lot now. Wouldn't you think they'd send it back to the states to figure it out? Because it is so political, numbers and...
No, it's going to go to the Supreme Court.
But will they hear it?
Yeah, they're not necessarily going to send it back to the state. I mean, they'll send it back to the state and say, redraw the lines.
Dr. Fischer, could you repeat the question?
Okay, the question was, would the Supreme Court say, okay, states, you figure it out? Okay, they'll do that if they say, we don't approve of these district lines for whatever reason, and we'll send it back to the states to redraw. And typically that ends up into a federal court at the lower level. So. Yes?
Is there a limit or is there a time of how often they can redistrict?
That's a good question. They're supposed to redistrict after each census. Okay. There have been some states, I think Texas at one point, there was talk when one party gets control of the state legislature, let's go out and redistrict. Okay. It hasn't been done, but there has been talk about that. As the state legislature shifts in partisan control, can the new majority then say, okay, let's go out and tinker with the lines? Okay. It's possible, but it hasn't been done, but there's been talk about it.
So that's not a constitutional issue
No, and I mean, there's nothing in the Constitution that addresses
about
that.
it. So
No.
it just typically has been done after each census.
Well, it's been done after each census, and that's been required
Oh, okay.
to a portion. Okay. Now, how it's done, again, the question is, if a new majority takes over a state legislature halfway through the 10-year period, could they then go out and say, okay, let's redistrict?
Dr. Fischer, does the Shelby v. Holder case, how does that bear on this issue?
Okay, and the Shelby, that has sort of let states sort of loose to do what they want, okay, and then get challenged after the fact, so there's no pre-clearance. So that's given states wider latitude to do what they want, especially states, well, primarily, states under the old Civil Rights Act or Voting Rights Act, they had to get pre-clearance for any sort of major change.
I've read where some states have commissions and
Yes.
their recommendation stands. Other states have committees. So could you say a little about the different structures?
Well, they're different. You can have commissions. Okay, the question is some states have commissions, and so how does that work? It can work in 2 or 3 different ways. One, the state legislature can create a commission and appoint people, and they draw the districts, and that's accepted. Or they can draw the districts, then sent to the state legislature who would vote to approve or not approve. And then there's instances where commissions can come up with districts, and it could then would go to the state legislature for approval, but then the state legislature could modify it. So there's no one set model of the commission in terms of, but again, it will vary from state to state. Here in Alabama, it's just state legislature does it. Yes.
I really
recently had a German friend that talked to me about their system, which is, I think, more proportional representation, and which seemed very, very fair to me. But is the reason that that would be really hard to do here is because we're divided into 50 states and each state can do what they want, and so we don't really have a national, or why can't we do that here?
Okay, so the question is about, could we have proportional representation, such as in Germany and other countries? To do that, we would need to sort of abandon one of the rules, which is first past the post. That is, whoever wins in the first congressional district has to have just one more vote than anybody else. Okay, so one of the consequences is we have two major parties, and third parties typically have a very, very difficult time winning because it's hard to make the case that you might get that one more vote against the two major parties. If you had a proportional system, you would have to be, one, you'd have to have an at-large election. So all 7 representatives would be up for election from the whole state of Alabama. And then it would have to be a case of, we're going to take the top 7 vote getters. That is, it's not going to be whoever got the most votes. And if you had a situation like that, then it would make sense for third parties and to have multiple parties, proportional representation. But you have to, like I said, change the rules on how they're selected. Does that make sense? Okay, so if there's seven representatives and the top 7 vote getters, then you could have proportional representation.
I think California, they call them propositions, I think. We call them amendments, they call them propositions. There was a proposition last year that went to that form of voting. So when you got your ballot, you had everybody running for a specific position, and the top 3 went to the primary. So it didn't matter if you were Republican, Democrat, Independent, or atheist.
Right.
If you were in the top 3 vote getters, then you moved ahead. So you could actually wind up with all Republicans or all Democrats or all independents in any given situation.
Right, but you still end up with the same problem of the two parties. That doesn't really go to proportional representation.
In 1960, Alabama did that for all representatives ran statewide. The low man on the totem pole was Frank Boykin at the time, lost out.
Okay. All right. If we did it sort of on a continuous basis and third parties and again, the notion is you'd have to sort of break the dominance of the two major parties, Democrats and Republicans, to make proportional representation work. And there was that occasion. There was also earlier, there was another point in time where we had statewide elections. And again, one of the things about redistricting where it gets really contentious is when you lose a representative. Okay, so I think recently Mississippi lost one, and that meant that you have incumbents suddenly finding that they're in a brand new district, or they're fighting in another incumbent for the same district.
I have read that Alabama stands to lose a representative in the next census, so we could be in that position.
Yeah, it's a possibility. If the population doesn't grow and remain stagnant, then we're liable to lose a representative.
Change the subject. Are you still doing polling?
No, I haven't. I haven't done polling in a while. I started the USA polling group, and I used to do weekly polls for the newspaper back when we had a newspaper, and did that for about 5 years. I'm sort of happy now that I'm out of it, because it used to be you could come up with a representative sample, and all you needed were the area code and the exchanges, and I could make sure I had a representative sample. But now with cell phones, Okay, there's no guarantee that if I have a 251 area code, that I'm actually there. So I'm sort of happy to be out of it right now. Anything else?
Well, on that count, are polls less valid? I'm wondering about the numbers and who's even answering the phone anymore. And what does it mean that they get a certain number of who?
One of the things, there's been a lot of controversy over if you just do landline calls, that you get it gets skewed to older people. And okay, I abandoned my landline. I got tired of all the phone calls. So you didn't get young people. So there are companies that develop samples. So they'll develop a sample of landline and cell phone cases and geographically bounded. So it's possible, but it's very, very expensive. The other thing that's occurring in polling is they're using the internet. They're generating internet samples, and it's been reasonably successful. But again, part of it is, if you're using telephones, obviously if you don't have a telephone, there's no possibility you're going to be part of the group. And then the issue of landline versus cell phone. And again, there's a sort of age differentiation there.
Landline, you have caller ID.
Right. I mean, I'm on my cell phone, I'm sure all of you have noticed now you get all sorts of calls and they will mask their numbers. So one time I got a call from my phone number on my cell phone.